funny Valentine, you know, everyone's favourite slightly murderous 23rd President of the United States, is a fantastic villain. Nothing more to say there. I mean, that's not exactly a controversial take, but I thought it would be fun to give my own analysis of his character and try and explain why as a villain and as a character he works so well. Now, I want to keep this video as concise as possible, so let's just get straight into it then. Obviously, major spoilers for Steel Ball Run. If you don't want to get spoiled, and believe me, you don't, I would advise clicking off this video. But with that being said, why don't we start this dissection on, from my personal experience, one of the most interesting villains in the world of anime and manga. In any form of media, there's nothing more underwhelming than a bad or even mediocre villain. You know, all those one-dimensional villains where their whole character trait is that they're evil for no other reason than just being evil, and have a generic cliche motive like world domination or something like that. And I think JoJo villains can sometimes fall down this hole. Specifically, probably my least favourite villain in the series, Cars from Part 2. Mainly due to his motives to become the ultimate being. Okay, cool, do you want a gold medal for that? I could not care less about his motivations, and that's a huge problem when it comes to a villain. But then, on the other hand, you have fantastic villains such as Yoshikage Kira from Part 4, ironically due to his lack of motivation and just how believable he is. He has no over-the-top motive other than his own individual satisfaction, making him seem like a believable and realistic serial killer. Apart from the whole thing of having a 7-foot cat that blows people up, but you get the idea. And it comes as no surprise that Funny Valentine falls into that latter category, starting with a word I've been throwing around quite a lot, motivation, of which, in the case of Valentine, no one really seems to have a definitive answer for. But if there is one thing I'm certain about that I don't understand why so many people question about, is that despite his seemingly honourable motives on the surface, he still is undeniably an awful person doing awful things. Valentine's ultimate goal is to obtain the corpse of Jesus Christ in an effort to dispel all violence and suffering away from the country, with it instead all being transferred to foreign nations, being forced into dealing with the sins of the United States. For example, once Valentine awakens Love Train, we see him deflect Johnny's nail bullets to places such as France and Vietnam in an effort to maintain the happiness of his country. We're constantly reminded during the entirety of Steel Ball Run that Valentine claims he does not regret any of his actions and they all came with the sole purpose of serving his country, a seemingly honourable motive. However, his radical patriotism forces the rest of the world to bear the brunt of America's misfortune, which objectively shows he is a morally twisted person. He knowingly diverts death to other countries, all under the so-called good of the United States. But then we get onto another interesting part of his character, that he is a complete liar. In several instances we see him straight up murder citizens of his country and do whatever he pleases. So is all that he said a complete lie? The murder and torture of fellow Americans doesn't sound all too patriotic to me, and certainly not for the good of the United States as he claims all his actions to be for. But with that being said, the only conclusion we can take is that his lies have meaning behind them, otherwise known as propaganda, which is pretty evident by how the general public seem to adore Valentine, and even the fact he was democratically elected as the US president to begin with. This man is walking, talking propaganda. I don't know if you've noticed, but he is incredibly American, hence this video coming out on July the 4th. But going back to how I was saying, a surprising amount of people consider him as a morally righteous and good person. I don't think it will be too far-fetched to say Valentine's propaganda affects not just the people in the manga, but the reader themselves. Hey, Vsauce. Michael here, but jokes aside, I mean, that is a pretty extreme point I'm making, but honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if the people who do consider him the true hero are in actuality another victim of his lies, under the false guise of, once again, all of his actions being for the good of the United States. I think the real TLDR is the fact that in the first place, people are debating online whether or not Funny Valentine is a good person, when, for most of the characters, it's often a clear-cut question. It speaks magnitude as to how effectively Araki wrote him into the story. His intense patriotism juxtaposed against the casual murder of his own people obviously paint him out to be a complete liar, but at the same time, you could argue otherwise just by how far Valentine goes to uphold that lie. For example, his final quote in the manga, "My heart and actions are utterly unclouded, they are all those of justice." Right until the bitter end, he upholds all of his ambitions, never once admitting any wrongdoing in his actions, remaining under the warped delusion that everything he did really was for the good of the United States. Now, one thing I haven't really touched on yet is his backstory, and I'll be honest, from a storytelling point of view, I'm not a huge fan of how Valentine falls into the generic shonen trope of having his backstory explored for the first time right before he's about to die, but whatever, you can't have everything. When taking Valentine's backstory into consideration, you can argue that his later actions were as a result of being a product of his environment and all the trauma he endured en route to becoming president. First of all, he first learnt of patriotism from his dad, a soldier who in 1847 was sent to war and was tortured but ultimately decided to take his own life as to not betray his country, and this would have surely come with a huge emotional impact on Valentine, who was then just a young boy. And then during his service in the American Civil War, where the concept of patriotism would have been thrown out the window when patriotism for the United States couldn't really exist when his other enemies were fellow Americans, and this all leads to his warped sense of patriotism and the sheer disconnect between his words and his actions. Through words alone, he is without a doubt the patriot he claims to be, but his actions paint him out to be the complete opposite. Individualistic and self-centered, with the epitome of this being the famous napkin scene and the constant motif of taking that first napkin. Power, glory, happiness, culture, law, money, food, the hearts of the people. I have taken the first napkin. This quote perfectly emphasises all that is wrong with Valentine's quote-unquote patriotism. If this is what he believes the napkin represents, then all his ambitions boil down to a monopoly on absolute power. He cares solely about himself. And during his final speech with Johnny on the beach, we see how far he'll go to protect his own selfish ideals, going so far as to use Gyro as a bargaining chip for his own freedom. But it is still those final words that fascinate me. Not necessarily the words themselves, but the context behind it. He's about to use his second pistol to kill Johnny, and he wants this to be the final thing he ever hears. Was he being genuine? Yes, my ultimate interpretation is that he was indeed being genuine. By this point, he had no reason to continue the lie to Johnny, and he truly believed all his actions were to serve the United States in the name of justice. But the problem is his warped view on justice. In the eyes of Valentine, I think it would be reasonable to say that he has a much more selfish view on justice, where he believes he is the sole saviour of the United States. Only he is able to bring about change in his deluded perspective. And when looking at it this way, weirdly enough, I find myself drawing a lot of unexpected similarities with Kira. Not JoJo's Kira, but Light from Death Note. They both claim to stand for justice, they needlessly kill innocents along the way to achieve their goals, they both genuinely believe all of their actions are righteous and for the good of society, and they both believe they are the only people capable of carrying out their respective goals. Although these two characters are ultimately pretty different, it still is an interesting thing to think about that I didn't initially pick up on, but anyway, I digress. Valentine is such a fascinating character due to how much there is to dissect about him. Was everything he said genuine, or was it all a lie? Or maybe a mix of both, as I think it is. He is as far as you can get from some of those awful one-dimensional villains you often see in anime. But of course, the most important question of all. How did he go from a short fat man at the start of part 7 to a 7-foot man chiseled out of stone by the end of the part? I mean, pretty much all the panels shown in this video are of Valentine in the latter half of the manga, but for some reason, it looks completely different from when he's first introduced. I know it's because Araki likes to change his art style, well, whenever he feels like really, but it makes it no less distracting for me. Am I being pretentious? I feel like I am, so let's move on. I think by this point I've analysed Valentine's motives as well as I can, and now I just want to relax a bit and instead talk about some other factors that make him a great villain. For example, Valentine's stand, dirty deeds done dirt cheap, otherwise known as D4C, or the infinitely superior filthy acts at a reasonable price. Nice. D4C is one of my favourites, if not my favourite stand in the series, allowing Valentine to travel to parallel universes by being closed between two objects. Is it a cool concept? Absolutely. Does it make any sense? Good one. D4C's introduction with the whole Who Shot Johnny Joestar part is one of my favourite parts of Steel Ball Run. It keeps you guessing all throughout the arc and is probably up there as one of the most memorable parts of the entire manga, for me at least. All of this build-up culminates in the revelation that D4C can allow for multiple realities to coexist at the same time, which still doesn't make any sense. This concept is brought up here and here alone, never coming up ever again, but it's still a cool idea nonetheless. I'd highly recommend this video by X Thoughts on the matter if you're interested, which makes a lot better sense of D4C than I ever could, because as cool as Valentine's stand is, my god is it confusing. But anyway, one final point I want to discuss before I start to wrap it up is Valentine's overall presence in the story, if that makes sense. Unlike a lot of JoJo villains who make their debut midway through their respective parts, we see Valentine looming from the shadows pulling the strings right at the start of Steel Ball Run. Valentine's ominous build-up was handled incredibly well in my opinion. His ominous atmosphere creates a sense of unease during the first half of part 7, leaving the reader in suspense as to how his true motives come into the story and how he'll interact with our main characters. This is why I think the whole Who Shot Johnny Joestar part works so well. By this point, Valentine was for the most part a behind-the-scenes character, mentioned not seen, until here, the first time we see him in action, and the unveiling of D4C. This threatening atmosphere Valentine carries around him remains present throughout the entire manga. He's a character that just feels dangerous. And with that being said, I should come to a conclusion. President Funny Valentine is a fantastic villain, mainly due to how complex he is and how he's a constant expression of polar opposites. One moment he's disempathetic, the next he's respectful. One moment he's patriotic, the next he's selfish. One moment he's genuine, the next he's a liar. But with that being said, all we can do now is sit back and wait until hopefully Steel Ball Run gets an anime, which will be first announced in March 2025. And with that, I'll be back in the next video. See ya!